The same hills were won and lost dozens of times. Punch-drunk infantrymen fought with everything they had. Air attacks rained down on the communists.
After the firefight, the American airstrikes hit the North Koreans on either side of the river. The North Koreans were screaming. We heard them, and we were a mile or more away. Floyd Atkins, B Company.
The river line was eventually restored, and the North Koreans fell back to lick their wounds. The red tide had been halted for the first time. By mid-August, the United Nations had built up enough manpower to level the playing field. Units arrived through the port of Busan from nations as diverse as France, Turkey, Thailand, and Ethiopia. The British Commonwealth forces, drawing men from Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were also important contributors. Most of these men were too young for World War II. They were eager to make their own mark on this new battlefield, but few of them could comprehend the harsh realities of war that awaited them. American troops in particular showed a brash confidence coming off the boat.
Busan was like being in a college town on homecoming Saturday. The kids were terrific. They didn't walk off the dock, they swaggered off. Their attitude said, "Don't worry about it, the Marines are here." Second Lieutenant Tom Gibson.
Among those arriving were thousands of black recruits. Unlike their predecessors in previous wars, they would serve in mixed units, fighting alongside white troops for the first time. And while most branches of the military still practiced segregation in 1950, the demand for fresh soldiers was immediate, and units were filled on a first-come, first-sent basis, regardless of race. Mixed units cooperated well on the hills of Korea, whether in the midst of combat or campfire sing-alongs. But on September 1st, 1950, all attention turned to the enemy, who launched a final offensive all around the wall of the perimeter. The communists limped forward with exhausted men and a broken supply line, but they were fought out and couldn't sustain the drive. Now they were losing the race against time. The moment was right for the United Nations to strike back, and General MacArthur knew just where to do it. For weeks, General MacArthur had been eyeing the port at Incheon for a counterstrike. Incheon was nestled along the shores of the Yellow Sea. It was the closest port to Seoul and a major supply center. But it was deep in enemy territory and laden with natural obstacles, such as the 33-foot shift between high and low tide, the largest in the world. To make matters worse, Air Force flyovers revealed that the islands in the harbor were guarded by North Korean troops. The hazards were tremendous. Naval commanders protested the plan, but MacArthur was adamant. He sent a telegram to the Pentagon on September 6th that read, "There is no question in my mind as to the feasibility of the operation, and I regard its chance of success as excellent. I go further and believe that it represents the only hope of wresting the initiative from the enemy and thereby presenting the opportunity for a decisive blow." The loss of Incheon would be an immense psychological defeat for the North Koreans. Conversely, control of Incheon would give UN forces a tremendous boost in position and morale. It offered a secure beachhead from which to launch attacks on Kimpo Airfield and Seoul, 25 miles away. But the operation called for amphibious teams to land on a small beach, scale a seawall, and attack directly into a city. It would require soldiers of unparalleled bravery. MacArthur created a special 10th Corps to carry out the operation. Divisions from the Army, Marines, and Navy were pulled from the action around Pusan to lead the charge. As the soldiers set sail for Incheon, they reflected on what lay ahead.
As soon as we pulled out of Pusan, we began to get the briefings on the tide situation in the Incheon harbor area. None of us ever had any experience operating under such tidal conditions before, let alone ever having been involved in an amphibious landing. As soon as the morning of September 15th approached, we realized that we had all the ingredients for disaster on our hands. Ensign George Gilman, USS Mount McKinley.
The invasion strategy was as complicated as its target. Incheon's harbor was too shallow at low tide for large ships to maneuver. So MacArthur decided to invade in 2 phases, synchronized with the high tides. Wolmi-do, the main island at the entrance to the harbor, would be assaulted with the first tide in the morning. The main event would follow with the second tide at night. 5 days in advance of the operation, Marine jets began blanketing Wolmi-do with bombs. Two days before, surface ships joined in. And so it was on the morning of September 15th, 1950, the 10th Corps moved in on burned-out Wolmi-do. The North Koreans had been caught off guard and gave up the island easily, suffering more than 300 casualties in the process. Only 20 American troops were injured. None were killed. For the next 11 hours, the 10th Corps Infantry waited for the tide to roll back. While they rested, 230 vessels moved in, and Marine corsairs ravaged the city of Incheon. Troops on Wolmi-do watched the air assault unfold. Reporter Jack Siegel was there to record the reaction.
Yeah, what do you think of those Marine corsairs? Now, those Marine corsairs are pretty swell things to have around. Here comes another one of them down on the other side of that hill. Now, there go 2 rockets. Look at that man. He went right down over the rim of the hill. He's over on his side, now coming directly over it.
As the evening approached, the 10th Corps unleashed the main thrust of the invasion. The landing targets were Red Beach, near the heart of the city, and Blue Beach to the south. Heavy naval and air bombardment cleared the path ahead of them. Landing ships made their way to the shore. Tanks and heavy equipment were unloaded onto the beaches. Infantrymen prepared to infiltrate the city on foot. Red Beach was secured within an hour and a half, and troops entered the streets of the city on the lookout for snipers. The following morning, Red Beach and Blue Beach were linked, and the operation was complete. Amazingly, the invasion was executed with such precision that only 20 UN soldiers were killed. MacArthur's gamble was a rousing success, and no one was more delighted than the great general. But his thoughts quickly turned to the real prize that lay just over the horizon. The loss of Incheon put the North Koreans still fighting south of there in deep trouble. The UN invasion was completely unexpected, and most of the Red Army was still fighting in the Pusan perimeter area, 130 miles south. Communist troops there were never informed of the defeat at Incheon. They fought on for a week afterward, unaware that they were in danger of being cut off. But when word of Incheon finally trickled down to the perimeter, they fled northward almost immediately. Meanwhile, the 10th Corps marched northeast from Incheon on the road to Seoul. They were battle-ready and let nothing stand in their way. The first target inland was Kimpo Airfield. As the closest major airstrip to Seoul, its value was immeasurable. Kimpo fell easily to the Marines on September 18th. Within 2 days, Marine corsairs were launching airstrikes on Seoul from there. Kimpo would play a key role in conquering the city. The 10th Corps had a three-pronged plan. The 5th Marines would cross the Han River directly north of Kimpo, and then swing east and attack the city's western flank. Meanwhile, the 1st Marines would capture the suburbs just south of Seoul, and then join the 5th Marines to attack the city's west side. Finally, the Army 7th Division would rush up from the Pusan perimeter and cut off North Korean reinforcements on the eastern side. The Marines crossed the Han as planned, but hit strong resistance in the hills west of Seoul. Heavy fighting took its toll on the Marines. The North Koreans were dug in deep and stuck to the hills like glue. Tank fire and air support rained down on the Communists for 3 days. Even flamethrowers couldn't loosen their hold. The battle came down to the last man, almost literally. On a crucial ridge known as Hill 66, Marines made a final push for control. The last men standing charged heroically with their bayonets and pried the Communists from their foxholes. When the smoke cleared, just 33 of the company's 206 Marines stood to savor the victory. Southeast of the city, the Army 7th Infantry was blazing a trail, advancing north like a steam train. On September 22nd, it beat back an enemy tank battalion and captured another airfield at Suwon, 20 miles southeast of Seoul. Air missions from Suwon and Kimpo against Seoul helped clear the way for the soldiers below. By September 24th, UN troops held the high ground around the capital.
I'll never forget the sight I saw. Down below was a very big city. Smoke was coming from everywhere. Buildings and houses were on fire. You could see the Corsairs dive down from the sky, then swoop back up, leaving a puff of black smoke and a dull explosion. From the top of that hill, it looked like I was watching a movie right before my eyes, except that it was for real. John Bishop, Private First Class.
The next day, the North Koreans fled the city. American soldiers rushed down from the hills in triumph. Seoul, the economic and cultural center of Korea, was back in friendly hands. On September 29, 1950, dignitaries flew into Kimpo and made their way to Seoul for a celebration. It was full of pomp and pageantry. The United Nations wanted the world to know that their police action was well in hand. But snipers could still be heard in the distance during the ceremony, an audible reminder of the dangers still lurking on the horizon. In September of 1950, the momentum was shifting dramatically in favor of the United Nations. The 8th Army was pushing northward at a pace that recalled Patton's drive across France after Normandy. The first objective was to reach the 38th parallel, where the war began, to reclaim South Korea's old borders.